thing. I'm not deputy foreign editor of The Guardian. I'm assistant foreign editor, which is one step definitely downwards. Anyway, 20 years ago, when I was the substitute columnist for an obscure magazine barely known in America called The New Statesman, on a freezing park bench in Washington, a young American soldier called Ron Riddenhauer told me what was then the unpublished story of the My Lai massacre, the killings which would become the lasting symbol of the American destruction of Vietnam. He also told me the story of the months of brush-off and indifference as he tried to interest the mainstream press in the cold-blooded murder of more than 100 Vietnamese villagers. But of course, to the press, it wasn't news, it wasn't a story. Everyone knew that Vietnamese villagers were killed by American soldiers all the time. However, the story finally came out thanks to him and various other fairly marginal journalists who forced it onto the agenda. And years later, Mrs. Meadlow, who was the mother of one of the young Americans who took part in those My Lai killings, said in a chilling documentary which Channel 4 showed a couple of years ago, "I gave the US Army a good boy. What did they do to him?" It's a question, like the fate of Vietnamese peasants, that very few American intellectuals or journalists have ever been interested in. Of course, their class are not the sort of people who go to fight wars. They just write about them. And it's what they write, or more important, what they don't write, which allowed the My Lais of 20 years ago and last week's Al-Mutala shootings of men who'd already given up, mostly shot in the back, to be considered acceptable in our society. Now, Western intellectuals, whose function should be to give the moral leadership which our political class so long ago abdicated, have in the last months, and particularly in the last week, displayed a callous indifference which even eclipses the My Lai days. Outrage can be the only human response to the uncounted Iraqi civilians who've suffered death, bereavement, injury, and ceaseless terror, hundreds of miles from what the journalists like to call the Kuwait theatre of operations, and a daily and nightly bombing on a scale so unthinkable that we have all preferred not to think about it. Outrage, too, is the only word for the tens of thousands of Iraqi soldiers, most of them conscripts, who've been buried in mass graves far away from television cameras over the last few days, on a scale of killing which dwarfs the many My Lais of the last major American war. General Schwarzkopf learnt a lot of lessons in Vietnam, and two in particular he's used to tremendous effect in the last week. The first of them was not to worry too much about the press. A 48-hour news blackout over the worst of the killings raised practically no media protest. And as the news of the massacres from the air of retreating Iraqi soldiers cut off on the road north from Kuwait City to Basra by those B-52 bombers we knew so well in Vietnam, as this news began to leak out in the media, practically nothing was done to put those 48 hours into the category of shame and horror, our shame and horror, where it belongs. The second lesson was, as he put it himself, not to get into a body count, their bodies, that is. Saudi and French sources have estimated that the 6-week ceaseless and unprecedented bombing campaign may have caused Iraqi casualties of anything from 50,000 to 150,000 or even more. And I think the very vagueness of those figures is an insult to those who've died and an insult to their families and a real gauge of how little those numbers matter to the Allies. Nobody's even begun to put any real estimate on the toll of that bombing plus the horrendous blank 48 hours which we may never know about, or to begin to convey the emotional devastation we've wreaked on Iraqi society. Even Western public opinion, completely numbed by the media's triumphalism, might find those hundreds of thousands dead a bit too much to swallow for a war which should never have happened and which President Bush likes to blame on one man alone, Saddam Hussein. However, as we now know, the US administration and President Bush himself began as early as last September to plan the very detailed attack on Iraq itself, while saying publicly that American soldiers were only in the Gulf to protect Saudi Arabia. The devastation of Iraq mocks the hollowness of President Bush's repeated affirmation that he had no quarrel with the Iraqi people, like his reassertion last week that American soldiers were risking their lives for their country and for all of us. These are examples of the hyperbole and hypocrisy which the press has swallowed, mostly so amazingly uncritically. Now, the Western intellectuals who denounced the war and the West's long complicity with Saddam Hussein, which contributed to it, were so few. Günter Grass, Regis Debray, John Berger, Arthur Schlesinger, so few that they never had a chance of denting the pro-war consensus so deftly orchestrated by the mainstream media. John Berger has written a brilliant article about the deafness, as he put it, of American power, in his appeal to other Europeans to follow his lead and not visit that country. This deafness also afflicts our media and the controllers of it, who very deliberately screened out the views of the Arab intellectuals living in this country, uniquely placed to analyze the Middle East throughout the last 7 months of crisis. Of course, by their closeness to the victims of the war, these people would have, perhaps inconveniently and emotionally, described it from the receiving end of the bombs. How different this would have been, and what an impact it would have made on public opinion in this country if we'd had those kind of people instead of all those military experts with their dreary explanations of a video of smart bombs. In a wonderful gesture described in an article entitled, "Did You Say Liberation?" the Moroccan writer Driss Schreibi threw his television out of the window of his third-floor flat in Paris as the jubilant announcer described the first smart bombs falling on Iraq. Watching it crash into thousands of pieces on the pavement, he imagined it killing the voices of all those experts hired to explain the East, the Arab mentality, and even, he says, the genetic difference between an Arab Muslim brain and a healthy Western one. Third world intellectuals are schooled in a much harsher environment of choices of principles than those in the West. In Europe, and even more in America, it's a matter of course that most intellectuals are co-opted by the establishment. In most of the Middle East, as in neo-colonial countries as far apart as Indonesia or Kenya or Latin America in the 1970s, repression and lack of democracy have driven writers, artists, and thinkers to jail, to exile, or to death. Their choice is always very stark: become a state intellectual, perhaps with a minor ministerial post, or continue to write about realities, the realities of poverty, injustice, and corruption. Then you face the consequences of the state's power ranged against you. In exile, these kind of writers have a style of uncompromising honesty, which stands out very awkwardly in the bland media diet we're accustomed to from the experts, including some Arabs, who get hand-picked by the media moguls. In the majority of these countries, as in Iraq until August 2nd, repression and its consequences for the political and intellectual life of the country is routinely ignored in the West. It's just like My Lai. The media knows it all already, so it doesn't ever make a story. Next Saturday, in the Conway Hall, you've probably seen some yellow leaflets around, there'll be a chance to hear in an all-day conference directly from some of those Arab intellectuals who are so rarely given the space in our media which they deserve. Throughout these last terrible months, as the US and Britain turned down from August the 23rd, one attempt at negotiation after another from their former client turned pariah, Arab intellectuals, including the 500 or more Iraqi writers and artists in the diaspora, saw the issues at stake with a clarity and a consistency which pushed Western intellectuals to shame. Now, these people, having lived close up to the horror of lives lived in Saddam Hussein's Republic of Fear, need no lessons from Western intellectuals about not being soft on dictators. But without exception, they were the people who called for negotiations and not for war. As one of them wrote, Every day, this unjust and illegitimate war goes beyond its theoretical objectives towards the total crushing of the Iraqi state and the imposition of a new regional order imposed by external force. All this, planned very early on by President Bush, is in total contradiction with the UN Charter. This was weeks before we know of the plans which are being unveiled just now for long-term stationing of American equipment in Saudi Arabia if it's too sensitive to keep American soldiers there, and increasing Allied forces seaborne off the coast where presumably the Arabs won't notice them, or for the Gulf states to finance the Egyptian army to remain as American proxies in the region, or for the reparations to bleed Iraq, which are now being imposed by the United Nations. Iraqi writers in exile stopped writing in the last weeks as a sign of mourning for the countries which, as many Arab intellectuals have written these last few weeks, was the cradle of civilization, and which still, in the darkest days of Saddam Hussein's dictatorship, symbolizes for them the home of poets, novelists, and philosophers of a distinction never matched in the cultural desert of Saudi Arabia or Kuwait. 80 intellectuals signed a text with the Algerian leader of the War for Independence against the French, Mohamed Harbi, and the Moroccan poet, Abdelatif Labi. It calls for popular support, led by intellectuals of many countries, to work for the reform of the United Nations and its saving from its current manipulation by one or several great powers. For a Middle East conference which could untangle the linked conflicts of the region, starting with the Palestinians' urgent need for a homeland, and a look at the future of the region's nuclear state, Israel. They call equally for a new concept of international law, which would ensure the Middle East's other greatest need: people's right to democracy, to social justice, to independence and control of their own wealth, and particularly, of course, their oil wealth. These themes, an end to double standards over the UN's concern for Palestinian rights, and new commitments to equality and independence within each country and within the region, are, in many, many texts from these and other distinguished thinkers, who may be exiled from the countries, but they remain their intellectual riches. As Harbi ended, we are promised a world of barbarism and ceaseless clashes if we do not heed these immediate needs. But the worst can always be avoided because millions of men and women want to avoid it. Of course, his optimism and his faith in ordinary people is absolutely right. And the challenge for the media, for us now, is to hear and reflect those views and not go on serving as his master's voice.